Revelation, Basic Bible Commentary. Introduction to Revelation. Nearly 300 miles north of Jerusalem, along the coastline of the Mediterranean, the land juts sharply to the west on what appears on the map to be an enormous peninsula. The coastline, as it bends west, forms the south edge of modern Turkey, land referred to by geographers as Asia Minor. The coast continues unevenly for nearly 300 miles before it turns north again. There, at the northward turn, several islands cluster in the Mediterranean. One of them, 30 miles out, is Patmos, in 1st century Rome, a prison island. Rome used Patmos to isolate political prisoners. Sometime between AD 81 and 91, a Christian prophet named John was exiled on Patmos. And while imprisoned on Patmos, John received the inspiration to write the book we know as Revelation. We know little about John other than what we can deduce from his writing. We know he wrote during a time when the church was young and faced persecution. He clearly had the care and welfare of the church at heart. And he saw equally as clearly the peril faced by the church, partly from persecution and partly from a more subtle danger: affluence. And clearest of all, he had searched the Old Testament, the Bible of the early church, for a key to understanding his times. What was clear to his eyes soon crystallized in his mind, preparing him for the visions he was to see and for the immense task of interpreting and explaining them to the church. The historical setting of Revelation. Number 1, Rome. From the time of Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor, 27 BC to AD 14, to Domitian, AD 81 to 96, the Roman Empire reached enormous proportions. It included land from Israel in the south to modern-day England in the north. That expansion took 11 emperors, slightly more than 125 years. Although the Romans tended to rule with an even hand, much depended upon the emotional stability of the emperor. 2 especially stand out for their instability and violence: Nero, AD 54 to 68, and Domitian. Nero was notoriously vicious and was the first great persecutor of the church. Early tradition accuses him of the deaths of Paul and Peter. The disastrous fire of Rome occurred during his reign, and to counter a pervasive rumor that he had started it, Nero blamed the Christians. Horrible tortures followed. Although the persecutions took place mostly in Rome, word spread and Christians were badly shaken. Domitian, coming to the throne 13 years after Nero's death, resumed the violence. Some forms of country and emperor worship had accompanied the growth of the empire, but it had never been a life or death issue. Domitian took it seriously. One of the main centers of his cult was the city of Smyrna. And we will see in the book of Revelation, chapter 2, verse 8 through 11, that Christians in that place faced a very difficult time. During the time when Revelation was written, Rome had accompanied its vast political expansion with an equally expansive program of business and economics. As John makes vivid in the later chapters of Revelation, Rome kept a world full of nations, builders, craft guilds, bankers, and merchants well occupied. Shipping routes spread from Rome in every direction, tying most of the ancient world to its web. From that rich commerce and its exciting variety of goods and opportunities, Christians found an endless supply of subtle enticements. Number 2, the church. By the time of Domitian, several decisive events had occurred in the church. For one, the Christians who had remained in Jerusalem after Jesus' death had finally left. Within a year after their leaving, AD 70, the Jews rebelled against Rome. In retaliation, the Roman army destroyed Jerusalem. From that time on, the early church was cut off from the city of its origin. However, thanks to its kinship with the Jews, it could continue to suffer the aftershocks of persecution aimed at the Jews. Since Paul's journeys to Asia Minor, that area had responded increasingly well to Christian missionary activity. Since Paul's journeys to Asia Minor, that area had responded increasingly well to Christian missionary activity. By AD 75, Asia Minor was no longer the mission field. It was the home of the church. The church's roots held more firmly in Asia Minor than anywhere else in the world. Ephesus was its spiritual center, much as Jerusalem had been for the early Christians and for the Jews before them. The new home was a mixed blessing. Large cities and good ports put the church at the heart of the ancient world. The mission advanced, but advancement brought increased visibility, and when Christians refused to worship the emperor, it was even more necessary to make an example of them. The success of the Christian cause almost meant the entry of many Christians into the mainline culture. The subtle temptations of affluence and influence followed. Indeed, John worried as much about that as he did about persecution. Within the space of 2 generations, the church had changed its environment from Israel to Asia Minor, had survived the death of nearly all of its founders, and had gone from the exhilaration of rapid expansion to the ravages of unwarranted persecution and the incursion of greed and temptation. By the time John was on Patmos, the worst sides of all those changes enclosed upon the church. To John, things seemed out of control. John wrote his book to a church that needed to have its apparent chaos put in the larger perspective of God's controlling purposes. Behind the scenes, he wrote, God is even now making the powers of evil accomplish the divine will. History is coming to its end, but it is the end that God has in mind for it. To the Christians who have given in to temptation, John wrote, quote, keep the faith. God knows your sins, end of quote. To those who kept the faith and suffered the consequences, John wrote, quote, God is in control. Hold on, endure, end of quote. Number 3, the church between 2 cultures. During the first century of the Christian church, 2 great cultures still shaped the thought and life of the people of Asia Minor. Obviously, Rome exerted influence, but the area had been dominated by Greece for years before that. Without the resources of mass media, it was not easy for one conquering nation to obliterate the influence of another. It took a great deal of time for the culture of one to replace the other. For a long time in Asia Minor, the Greek and Roman cultures coexisted somewhat like 2 waves. The first on the shore saturating the sands and then receding, the second overarching and overreaching the first. For a while, although they moved in contrary motion, the 2 pressed upon the shore simultaneously. Greek life, lore, and language, first on the shores of Asia Minor, had spread far and soaked deep. The second wave, Rome, rose higher and reached farther, and fell with more oppressive weight. The Jews had settled in Asia Minor before the time of Jesus, well during the time of Greek control. They spoke Greek. The early Christians, like Paul, spoke Greek. The Gospels were written in a Greek dialect of the common people, called Conn. All of the books of the New Testament were first written in Greek. The official language of the Roman Empire was Latin. It was the language of the new, higher, and larger wave, and it settled over Asia Minor from the top down. That is, it was the language of the politicians, of administration, and of business. Most people conducted their daily lives in Greek, and that language, too, had its various levels. Philosophy, religion, and much social life found their natural voices speaking Greek. It was the tongue of the cultural highbrow, but it was also, in some of its dialects, the tongue of the street. The book of Revelation was not highbrow. John wrote in Greek, not Latin. That is, he wrote in the language of the people and not of the powerful. But he also wrote awkwardly and was often uncertain about the proper tenses of verbs. His was almost the language of everyday life, of the common folk. In its vitality and color, it was very different from the stern administrative prose of Latin. As different as the clamor of enthusiasm in the streets is from the solemn deliberations of a budget committee. If we can judge from John's book, then the early Christians lived between two cultures, not at all members of the dominant class. Nor were they, for the most part, warmly identified with the Greeks. They spoke the language of the common person, not the intellectual, and they worked most closely, at least at first, with the Greek-speaking Jews who had settled in Asia Minor many years before Rome became its captor. The emperors of Rome. The following list of emperors of Rome contains 11 names. In Revelation, many references are made through symbolism to the emperors of Rome. Often they refer to the time of Domitian, who ruled during the era in which John wrote. But the references are confusing. For example, he is at times considered the seventh emperor. At other times, it is assumed that Nero, who died in AD 68, will arise from the dead and come back to rule. And he will be the eighth emperor. To further confuse the matter, it may also be the case that Domitian is referred to as though he were a second Nero. We do not know how John kept count, but most scholars agree that he probably did not regard Galba, Otho, and Vitellius as emperors. They each reigned briefly during a time of great confusion and met unfortunate deaths. None had much to do with shaping the contours of Roman history. One suggestion for understanding John's references to the 7 emperors is to remember that 7 is a number of completeness. He may simply have had in mind the entire leadership of Rome up to this time. Augustus, 27 BC to AD 14. Tiberius, AD 14 to 37. Caligula, 37 to 41. Claudius, 41 to 54. Nero, 54 to 68. Galba, 68 to 69. Otho, 69. Vitellius, 69. Vespasian, 69 to 79. Titus, 79 to 81. Domitian, 81 to 96. Number 5, Asia Minor and the Mediterranean Sea. From the maps of the Mediterranean, one can understand the great advantage geography had given Rome. Chapter 18 of the book of Revelation shows us the merchants of the earth sobbing at the destruction of that enormous city. In that chapter, Babylon is John's special code word for Rome. But not only do the merchants sob, the shipmasters and seafaring men also cry out in grief. Not that they regret the fate of the Romans as people. They regret the loss of one of their most lucrative markets. Rome did receive much of its wealth over land. The roads of all of the lands around the Mediterranean had been made safe for travel. Roman soldiers guarded them. It was thanks to the Romans that Paul and Silas took their missionary journeys safe from harm. Rome had also cleared the sea of pirates. The nations of the Mediterranean could export and import. Lively commerce arose with Rome at its center. In fact, Rome became the economic safety net for the entire region. By John's time, the commercial interests of Rome reached as far overseas as India, to which Rome exported linen, coral, and metals, and from which were imported silks, perfumes, and jewels. Rome was also a vigorous importer of slaves. When one recalls that John refers to Christians as servants, and that the word he used is the ancient word for slave, one knows John had first-hand experience with the absolute obedience required of slaves. Not only Rome, but 2 of the cities to which John sent his letters were also important coastal cities, Smyrna and Ephesus. Like Rome, they shared the wealth gained from a thriving import-export business. In these Roman cities, the wares of the entire known world created unrivaled opulence for some. John knew the strategic importance of Rome at the center of that entire network of buying and selling. The inland cities to which John wrote in Asia Minor were also strategically located. They were, for the most part, gateway cities, opening to important land routes. Thyatira, for example, lay on a great road that connected the Hermus Valley and the trade centers of the east to the city of Pergamum. Laodicea, considerably south of Thyatira, lay on an important road that began at the coastal city of Ephesus and stretched far into Phrygia. Laodicea may have been the doorkeeper of the most traveled trade route to the west in ancient times. The area that housed the early church everywhere fed into the Roman overlord of the house. Revelation is not by accident, then, a book about two cities that contest with each other for control of history. The city of Rome, to John's eyes, reached everywhere through and beyond the visible landscape. Only the city of God had hopes of outreaching it. Who is John? The name John was not uncommon in Rome, and it was certainly widely used in the church and in its stories. John the Baptist, John the son of Zebedee, John the author of the Gospel, John the writer of the epistles, John the author of Revelation. Were some of them the same person? Some traditions said yes, some said no. Of all of the writings we have by men named John, the Gospel and the first two epistles seem most similar. Revelation, however, differs greatly from all of the others. It has a different style, different content, and uses a different vocabulary. Most scholars think the writer of Revelation was not the same person who wrote the Gospel. But who was he? We don't know who, but we can learn a lot about him from his book. For example, he spoke openly about Christ, even in times when Christians felt immense pressure to worship the emperor. He was faithful during times of persecution, so faithful that the authorities arrested him and exiled him on the island of Patmos. John was deeply aware of the social and political events of the day. He could grasp their general direction and could measure them by his own rule of faith. He had a pastor's concern for the churches in Asia Minor. Everything he wrote was directed to those tempted and beleaguered congregations, pointing behind the veil of daily events to the God who was working to save them and to bring history to its end. He knew the Old Testament well, especially the prophets and the first 5 books, the Torah. He had pored over those scrolls in search of the key that unlocked the secret of God's work in history. Old Testament images and symbols became the language of his faith, the way he learned to talk about the world and God's will. And he had found particularly important those prophetic writings called apocalyptic. Those books used dramatic images, vivid scenery, and extraordinary stories and parables, expressing itself in each of them as a testimony to God's glory, to the evil of the times, and to God's soon-to-occur intervention in the history on behalf of the faithful. John was first and foremost a Christian prophet. He believed that God had acted to save human beings through Christ. It was through Christ that he saw into the heart of God's purpose, God's plan to form and preserve the church into the end of time. Finally, John was well known and respected by the Christians in Asia Minor. His book, possibly the only one of its kind to come from a Christian, had to be accepted on the authority of his name alone. He was known well enough to know that that would be enough. Revelation